last lecture in the series. I must express my deep appreciation of your endeavor to make the series a successful one. And I'm really thankful to you for giving me the opportunity to chair the session, quote unquote. Rather, I should say you have given the opportunity to uh, think and deliberate over the issues which the speakers have raised. So, in that sense, I have really great appreciation and also my thankfulness to you and all the organizers who have been responsible for conducting the series so well. So I congratulate all the team that is involved in in the in this work. Let me come to the last lecture, which Professor Sirola has uh, uh, really so brilliantly delivered. This is a the subject, the title of his lecture is a fitting title to the closure of this series because this second part, which he mentioned in his letter to Ludwig von Fieker, remains a key document in unlocking the doors of the Tractatus. Tractatus has remained uh, definitely a great classic, but also a great enigmatic classic. It will not be easy to say that any interpretation that is available from the resolute to the non-resolute is the right one or is the final one. So that is the greatness of the book, the Tractatus, and also the greatness of the philosopher. Professor Sirola has rightly pointed out and has defended that ethics is central to Wittgenstein's Tractatus, though he has not voluminously written on ethics in this book. Had this not been the case, he would not have mentioned it to his friend that import, the central import of the book is ethical. So that claim proves itself that though he has not written so much about ethics as others do, and which Wittgenstein doesn't like to follow, uh, the central concern is ethics. What else it could be for him? Of course, in our terminology, I could say it is also a struggle, a spiritual struggle. A struggle to gain happiness, which he praised so highly about the life of a moral person. The happy person is a moral person. So happiness must have been the goal of ethics and the goal of his life as well. So ethics remains central to the Tractatus. I agree with Professor Sirola, and many will agree with him that ethics cannot be put aside if we understand Tractatus. Those who are mesmerized by the primacy of his emphasis on language, logic, could say that ethics is peripheral, it is incidental. But as he mentions in that letter, famous letter now, uh, he's doing everything, drawing the limits of language to make ethics possible, not ethics expressible. That was his constant theme, that ethics is ineffable. Anything that deals with a higher cannot be put in language. That was his firm commitment, and therefore he had to draw the limits of language and also of the word. So it was a tremendous responsibility of his philosophy to make ethics, and I will add religion in his sense of the term, not in the usual sense of the term, possible. So that remains as it is. Now, come to the second point, which Professor Sirola has highlighted, the nature of the self, the nature of the willing self, the nature of the transcendental self, and the related issue of solipsism, realism, etc. These are central also to the Tractatus, and Professor Sirola has given sufficient emphasis on decoding these sentences regarding self and the world, and also solipsism. There may be some variations regarding as to what he meant by solipsism. This is a point which I myself have been puzzled, which sort of solipsism he would have in mind. If his self is not a psychological self, and if his self is a transcendental self or metaphysical self, both words are common used by Wittgenstein, then the solipsism cannot be a psychological solipsism. The I cannot be the psychological I that any empiricist will be very happy to deal with. And let us remember, Wittgenstein was not an empiricist. He was an enemy of empiricism because he dissociated his philosophy from the entire environment of British empiricism. He had least regard for that kind of philosophy which reduces the self to a psychological I or a non metaphysical I. He was a pure metaphysician committed to a metaphysical realm or metaphysical idea of the self. If that is so, then the solipsism that he is talking about is a transcendental solipsism. This is how I will put it. Because when he says, I am my world, and when he says life and world are one, he cannot be making any cheap statement like an empiricist that the world is nothing but my personal private experiences. That could not have been in his mind. He must have something, there must be something great in his mind, something sublime. Let us put that way so that we can decode his message when he says, I am my world. Who can say I am my world except a metaphysician? Uh, say, like Wittgenstein, who says the I is the limit of the world. This is one statement, and is a transcendental limit of the world, a transcendental presupposition of the world, and also it is not a part of the world. Is very right, and this self is the same as the world. If we take this statement, I am my world, it requires a tremendous metaphysical insight and imagination to understand the meaning of it. A superficial reading may mislead us that Wittgenstein is making some statement which is not only empirically false but also psychologically impossible because I cannot be the same as my world. So there must be something metaphysically important in this statement. Yes, only solipsism can be the right way to understand when he says, I am my world. This is what a solipsist is likely to say. But in what sense? It must be in the sense that the world that he is talking of is the world as a whole, as Professor Sirola has emphasized. The world sub specie eternitatis. It cannot be the empirically understandable world, it must be metaphysically understandable world, the world seen sub specie eternitatis, and world seen as a whole. That must be the world he's talking about. And in this scenario, if he says that I and my world are one, that must carry a very deep metaphysical meaning. Uh, in the notebooks, as we know, that he mentioned about two godheads. One is I and the world. So in the Tractatus, he maintains a duality between I and the world. Sorry, in the notebooks. But in the Tractatus, when he comes to Tractatus, he says I and the world are one. So there must have been a progression in his thinking that if we keep the world and the I separate two different entities, perhaps we can never reconcile how this I will be a presupposition of the world. The duality will create more metaphysical difficulties. So, some kind of identity between self and the world has been metaphysically ensured by him. I'm not sure how to explain this, but let us only reflect over it. I am only inviting your attention to such a deep level or deep aspect of his thought. Then coming to the idea that this I, which is the limit of the world, and also which is the uh, metaphysically same as the world to speak sophistically, then this I is also the bearer of ethics. That is an important point which Professor Sirola has highlighted. And in fact, that is the crux of his theory of ethics. That it is the will, the transcendental will in that sense, not psychological will, is the bearer of ethics. In fact, the birthplace of ethics will be in the metaphysical self, in the transcendental self, and not anywhere else. Not in society, not in culture, and not in the world. All of them are ruled out by him. So he takes away the very foundations of the empiricistic, naturalistic ethics. The whole human ideas of ethics are really disowned by him. This transcendental self, not the psychological self. In Hume, psychological self is the bearer of ethics. But in Wittgenstein and perhaps in Kant, and therefore in Schopenhauer, because both Kant and Schopenhauer have a great similarity, ethics has its roots in the transcendental willing self. Then only ethics can have the true foundation according to him. But what does it mean to say that the non-psychological transcendental self is the bearer of ethics? What does it really mean? Does he want to subjectivize ethics? Does he want to make ethics a personal matter of an individual? I think none of this, because if you admit this, then you are back to Hume. Uh, the universality of ethics, which Kant established, must have been respected by Wittgenstein. That ethics is transcendental, and therefore ethics must be universal, and therefore ethics must be something which talks about the entire humanity, one can say. It talks about the entire world, the whole world. So, in that sense, Wittgenstein is saying that ethics, which originates in the transcendental self, also envelops the world, because the self and the world are not detached. They are not two different things that ethics has to cross from one subjective domain to an objective domain. That is, ethics will be concerning the world. In that sense, it has to be objective, but if it is rooted in the self, then it should be subjective. But none of these considerations are there in Wittgenstein. The whole project is transcendental project. Therefore, Professor Sirela has rightly pointed out that when he says, my will enters the world as if from the outside, there is no outside really. So the self cannot really transmigrate from the subjective domain to the objective domain. There is nothing of this sort. Self and the world are one. Therefore, if the ethics originates in the transcendental self, then the world must be ethically constituted. So, in that sense, ethics must be a condition of the world, because ethics is a transcendental condition of the world, like logic. Without logic, you cannot conceive how the world would be possible. Similarly, he says, without ethics, you cannot conceive how the world will be meaningfully possible. And therefore, the entire meaning of the world as a whole, as a metaphysical entity, must come from ethics and thereby from the transcendental self. So Professor Sirola has very ably and very with sufficient textual evidence and the support of many of the critics, he has established that ethics is central to Wittgenstein and ethics is transcendental and ethics is also the very condition of the world. So I think there is much to debate about it, but my observations are limited to these points, and I must congratulate Professor Sirola for giving a fitting conclusion to this series, because he's though the last but not the least. Okay, the last, but it is the most vital part of the Tractatus. He has dealt with the vital part of the Tractatus. I fully agree with many of his conclusions, and now it is open for discussion. Thank you, Professor Surala, and thank you, Professor Panda, for making this lecture possible even before Diwali, because Diwali is the physical light, but philosophy definitely gives us some intellectual light, if not a spiritual light. So let us celebrate intellectual Diwali today. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pradhan, for such insightful comments. It was really, a very, good learning for me to think further on those points which you raised.
Thank you. Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, sir. Now we open the lecture for discussion. Professor Ghosh, yes.
Thank you, Dr. Panda. We must thank Professor Vikram for for bringing forth the crux of the Tractatus, as Professor Pradhan has mentioned. Because you see, I was quoting somewhere from some writing that Tractatus is a cryptic and hypnotic tour de force. That means we we are just enamored by the first portion of the Tractatus, the logic, the language, and all these things. But actually, the thing is, the last portion is most important, because that is the crux of the matter, as Professor Pradhan has said. Because you see, simply see the reality. When he's talking about reality, reality is the existence or non-existence of state of affairs. That means he's not committed to anything. And if we accept that, then only we can probably explain silence to some extent. So this is one situation. And another point I want to say, that Wittgenstein was primarily, as we have seen from his biography, he was primarily a religious man. So religion was always in his mind, but he never tried to manifest it openly. Rather, he tried to open his religious views through ethics, because the Vienna circle was always a stumbling block for him, because he had a long association with the Vienna circle people. So these two things, I think Professor Pradhan has very nicely mentioned all these things. So we have to give emphasis on these things, and Professor Vikram has mentioned these things. Thank you. This is just an addition. You can say this is not observation and addition, and not anything to comment on this, because we are just trying to understand a great philosopher like Wittgenstein, who appears as something but actually he is something else. So that is the problem. Thank you.
Anjan, you unmute, please. We can't hear you.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Ghosh. Uh, so, would you like to say something? I agree with Professor Ghosh's remark on religion, because Hilary Putnam also mentions this in his book, Jewish Philosophy, a religious a religious way of life. So there, along with Levinas, Regenwick, Martin Buber, he puts Wittgenstein, who was not a Jew but had a Jewish ancestry, um, in the as a religious man. So he considers religion as one of the central theme of Wittgenstein's writing. Uh, of course, it has its own influence on ethics, as Professor Ghosh was saying. So that is one. That is where one religion and ethics can come together. Because for Levinas, ethics is, is primary that way. So
Yeah, Wittgenstein says that I'm not a religious person, but I
mm,
can't help thinking
mm,
any problem from a religious point of view. So there is
yes,
a lot of writing on his religious point of view, what he meant by that point of view. So actually, which takes us, deep into his highly, religiously motivated thought, which can be basically founded on the ethics. What I mean, mostly the work says are religiosity.
mm,
So religiosity found his. So, but he has a disdain towards the formal system of religion. So he
mm,
cannot identify with it.
yes, yes. Any other question? Uh, Vikrant, Vikrant has put something. Vikrant in the chat box.
Okay, yeah. He says solipsism might imply transcendental self, but must it be non empirical or exclusionary? Can solipsistic self include an either or concept of self? So, I think Professor Pradhan would also join in answering this because I was not proposing transcendental self as such, but solipsistic position, solipsism without an ego. Where I mean, this is how I was understanding. So it is where the ego or the self is reduced, to having no place in it. So, so definitely it's like transcends that space. So this is what which is meant by it. So yes, this is very unusual understanding of solipsism, and that's why Wittgenstein says what solipsists say
Mm,
makes a lot of sense to us, but how they say it is not acceptable.
mm,
so, so solipsism, which is limited to the self and the its ideas only, is not what is very appropriate presupposition. So I think this is what the transcendental nature of that self, overcomes that limitation of solipsism, where it is not required to deny the real world, and at the same time the self can transcend and the my word can be accepted, which becomes the source of ethics. So yes, this is very much possible, where the self is the egoless or the egoless solipsist position. That is very much possible. Yeah, Professor Pradhan.
I think there is one part of his question is this: whether transcendental self, if we accept this terminology, does it exclude empirical self? I think when Wittgenstein makes a distinction between the metaphysical self and the psychological self, he has this in mind. The empirical self will be the psychological self. If we, by common understanding of empirical, so if it is there is a transcendental self, which the metaphysical subject is, then it has to be non-empirical. So this duality, this uh, two ways of understanding self has to be understood this way. So Wittgenstein is debunking the psychological self for his own reasons. First of all, he doesn't follow Hume in tracing the source of the self itself to our experience, which is a bundle theory of self. None of this is admitting. He also says self is not the human being. So the human character of the self he also uh, puts aside. Therefore, he is moving in the direction of a metaphysical self, which we like to call the transcendental self. So, in that sense, it cannot be the same as the empirical self. So, this distinction we have to accept if we understand Wittgenstein correctly. Otherwise, we cannot understand how ethics will be possible and how the higher life will be possible. The empirical self doesn't need to have a higher life or doesn't need to have the idea of a higher life. Ask any human or an empiricist, he will laugh at the idea of a higher life. Maybe there may be a socially constructed higher life, but Wittgenstein's sense of the higher life has a different peculiarity which we must sympathize with, even if we do not admit it. So that is how I can respond to this question.
Yes. Professor Sarkar, Priyamada Sarkar.
Uh, I'm very sorry that I missed the main presentation of the seminar. I joined, in fact, when these discussions and questions part are going on. So that is why I really don't know what the speaker has said. So otherwise, always I have something to tell.
Okay, I mean, still you can.
You can just summarize like abstract kind of thing. If you say something, then I'll be enlightened.
That would be an extra burden on the part of the speaker.
On the speaker, yes, yes.
So
The main theme, the title.
I think the title is the second part of the Tractatus, a view from the inside. That's the title um, of the lecture. So I think that's okay. You can
Okay.
take time. Yeah.
Second part of the Tractatus.
Referring to Ludwig van Figures statement that how Tractatus is about ethics, or ethics occupies central theme of Tractatus, and that is
An unwritten part of the Tractatus.
unwritten.
Okay. Then, what exactly was Bikram's point? Like,
You have put me in a lot of difficulty now.
no, no,
Summarizing business is always very challenging. It will lead to a lot of misinterpretations.
no, no, no.
So, but
It's
let me
not that.
just give you a very brief, I mean, without much, just in a sentence or two.
Ha, ha.
So, it is an attempt to explore if we can understand why Wittgenstein could not write the unwritten part of the Tractatus, and what he meant by this inside view when he says that a view from inside, because he famously wrote Vicar on Vicar that
Yes, yes,
this limits of the sphere of the ethical is to be drawn from the inside.
yes,
So my submission here is that if we do not understand the uh, transcendental nature of the self, the metaphysical self, which is giving rise to a kind of a solipsistic world, and that solipsism is central to appreciate why the first person view cannot be pressed in which to give rise to the kind of philosophy which was Hegel. Hegel said that a very So, to understand Wittgenstein's ethics, it is important to appreciate and acknowledge first which is what he attempted in Lecture on Max, and which is also to do with settling with the problems of life or the ethical struggle. So, coming to terms with life or myself and the ethical struggle in the first person, they seem to be something which he has in mind when he's proposing the second unwritten part of it. I mean, again, this is what the brief of the whole talk.
Yes, this is very interesting and important too. Uh, I can only comment that after writing the Tractatus, after this phase um, is almost over or not yet over, when he was writing philosophical remarks, at that time he talked about a kind of despotic language uh, that at that time he was under the spell of verificationism, as it sounds, and that despotic language can be related to this solipsistic language which he was saying in the Tractatus. I think it was 5.62 or something. What the solipsists mean is quite correct. And there, in remarks, in philosophical remarks, in articulating the despotic language, he was saying, he was attempting to say what is correct in solipsism and how that could be expressed. Uh, like this is something which you can explore, and I think there is this point needs exploration, not much writing I have seen on this. Thank you, Vikram.
Thank you, Professor Sarkar. Yeah, he's not actually saying solipsistic language as such, but solipsism, if established the way Wittgenstein attempts, it creates acceptable space for my world, which is the repository of what the ethics we are talking about. So if ethics is to be located anywhere, then it is in that space of the my world, not in the world of facts or the contingent facts. So language would not be solipsistic, but it can be despotic. But the attitude which comes out of it towards the world, towards the contingent facts of the world, is what which becomes which sets the limits of the language and limits of my world, limits of the world. So that's why my
Yes, yes.
understanding, as Wittgenstein says, is that the first person account is all what we can do in ethics. Beyond that, it would lead to much more serious, than what he calls errors. It is much more, in magnitude than simply calling them errors. So this is those attempts may not be possible, to be done in philosophy. So, so yes, I mean that one can link. Ranjan, you are muted.
Any other question?
Hello. I just want to add one thing that
Please.
as Professor Pradhan has already said, when I am my world, he is reiterating this view, and that world is a transcendental world. Automatically, the question of solipsism is abolished, because in a transcendental world, the question of entering into the domain of solipsism will not come. So that is just an observation. How do you react to this?
Yeah, see, I mean, I'm seeing it like what we call epistemological solipsism. We are not saying that my word alone is there and nothing else. So we are saying that there are multiplicity of word because we are. I mean, he says the realism is not denied when solipsism is truly taken to the spirit. So when you are talking about a hard real world, then every one of us can have that my world, a solipsistic world. So, but solipsists usually do not recognize that that's kind of metaphysical, solipsism, which doesn't recognize the possibility of others and the others world. So in Wittgenstein, this is one difference. But after establishing this solipsism, the ego is also dissolved. That is where this transcendental part comes. So retaining my world, the real hard contingent world, and the possibility of others' world, this is unique, which I feel in Wittgenstein's solipsistic position, and this places the ethical position very well. So it is more of attitude, towards the contingent facts, which is what ethics is about.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, um, this is one small doubt regarding um, this debate on idealism, solipsism, and realism. Um, so this the shift from idealism to realism, um, and you I think you ultimately confined to this idea of realism, which Wittgenstein is advocating. So realism is based or on certain normative or ethical conditions, because for Wittgenstein, if ethics is important to live a meaningful life, so the kind of realism which we are expecting here is governed by or is conditioned by ethics, is not it?
See, this conditioning is not in the world. The self is not in the world. Ethics, which is the attitude of the self, is not in the world, but with or conditioning of the world. So this is how the difference is maintained. And after accepting a real contingent world of facts, you know, it is possible to say that the ethics is brought into the world by the self.
Hmm.
So that's what I mean. I
So
my
that ethical
attitude.
attitude is also transcendental attitude that uh,
Yeah.
in, in that sense.
So my question to Professor Pradhan was, if this privacy of the ethics, if denied, and we move towards this universal, going with Kant, I was finding it difficult to really argue because I mean, with Manoranjan, our writing is there on this privacy of moral perspective. So I find it very fascinating to keep
Yeah,
it private.
I have gone through some of your joint papers also, and they're very enlightening. The point is, if ethics becomes a private mode of living, then what will be the point of that higher? If it is so
Values.
private, it is so personal, my ethics is so personal, how can it carry the burden of the higher? Ethics is about the higher. So that really dissuades me from taking ethics as relative to persons. So relativism cannot work, or it is a mere personal attitude. The emotivism will not work. It must be, if the self is a metaphysical self, it is attitude towards the world is attitude from eternity. The to look at the world from the eternity point of view. So that sort of connection the self has with the world. World is real. There is no doubt about it. He is not denying the reality of the world. Remember, he is not talking about epistemological solipsism or epistemological realism, because he is not taking an epistemological standpoint in the Tractatus. It is all metaphysical. In fact, he says epistemology is a psychology of knowledge. So he is least interested in epistemology. He might be interested in epistemology later on, but in the Tractatus, when he was at the height of his uh, metaphysical thinking, he was least interested in epistemology. So he is not talking about epistemological realism. All that realism matters is for him the world and the self remain, as he tells us, the self is the extensionless point, but it is the presupposition, it is extensionless. It's a metaphor only, but it is not metaphysically minimal. I think it is metaphysically maximal. That extensionless point, I think we have to take in a metaphorical sense only, because self is not a physical object that you have extension. He means that it is the self which is the limit, and therefore it is the presupposition of the world. You cannot understand what the world is unless you really bring in the self. So because the world is my world, therefore self has is bound to enter into philosophy. So in that sense, self is indispensable, and the world is also indispensable. So both way, even if we accept solucism in the way a metaphysical solucism, let's call it, even then the world remains real. Really, he is not denying any of those things which common sense accepts or which science accepts. Only he is giving a metaphysical status to the world. Epistemologically, the reality of the world is not guaranteed, because we are not talking of the epistemological or the knowing or the thinking self, the Cartesian self. We are thinking of a metaphysical self, and which is also the willing self, because that is the bearer of ethics. So if that is so, then his realism is not definitely empirical realism. Let us call it anyway. It is a realism, uh, perhaps in the Kantian sense, it is a realism. The world is empirically real, but maybe transcendentally, it is how the world is eternally to us. That will be the transcendentally real world. It is eternally the world as a limited whole, as he expressed somewhere. So, in that sense, we have to make a distinction between the metaphysical realism and the realism of the empiricist and the epistemologist. So, in that sense, I suppose we can get somewhere nearer his way of thinking. We don't know what is the way of thinking, but we are approximating his way of thinking. Maybe he is trying to say that Salafism, when properly understood, Salafism is true, correct. That is the first assertion. But when you understand it properly, which cannot be expressed also, if you express about Salafism, then you are committing nonsense. So it is ineffable. But when you understand properly Salafism, you will see that realism is vindicated. So it is uh, no less, no loss, no gain kind of situation. So, in a sense, self is real, the world is also real, and the connection between the two is how ethics is projecting, how ethics comes out of the self and really penetrates the world itself. The world is ethically bound. So I think we have to understand by some of these terms, by suggesting that Wittgenstein is not thinking in the way we think commonsensically, empirically, and perhaps epistemologically. Maybe he has something else to say about this. Okay, thank you. Thank
Thank you.
Somewhere he said that the propositions of Tractatus are by their very essence nonsensical.
you. Yeah, yeah.
So I am just going to explain those nonsensical things. That is what he
In
said
fact, the
somewhere.
resolute readers have taken this so seriously. He
Yeah, yeah.
said he has told nothing excepting nonsense. So I think that is the way people can beat Wittgenstein with. But his where he says that some of these things cannot be expressed in language. That is his fundamental assumption. That don't push language too hard. It cannot express everything. Keep silence as a possible mode of thinking or reflecting. So I think that must have been in his mind. He had a great disrespect for the empiricist and the British kinds of thinkers. Somewhere he has said, I cannot sit and read Hume. I read somewhere. I cannot sit and read Hume, he says. And he hated the Cambridge Dons. He said, it is better not to talk about them because they do not do real philosophy. And he says it is better to talk to my maidservant than to the dance. This may be a despotic way of saying, very arrogant way of saying, but the meaning is very clear that don't do philosophy in this superficial way. Don't reduce everything to language. That is analytic philosophy. And don't reduce everything to experience. That is empiricism. So I think he had no sympathy with these philosophers. Russell, he disagreed so much so that ultimately they fell apart. And he says Russell has no philosophy of his own. He is jumping from one point to another. He has no respect for the empiricist Russell. Of course, Russell paid back in his own coin. He says Wittgenstein is not doing any, either he is doing mysticism or he is doing no philosophy. So these are the ways he reacted with his contemporaries. But he was concerned more with the vital matters of life, like sin. As Professor Sirola has said in his letter to Russell, he was more concerned with salvation, his emancipation from the sin, whatever he called it sin, and not to dabble in life the way Russell was doing. So that's the reason why both fell apart. Okay, thank
Uh,
you. Yeah.
I completely agree with Professor Pradhan. And linking this, I just want to make a comment that this ethics, this ethics is not like when he's saying the book's point is ethical, then he's not intending to mean the ethics that we read in Kant's ethics, empiricist ethics, not like that. It's different. It comes with the willing self, and that willing self is the limit of the world. So, and it has, whether it has got connections with the metaphysical subject, that is also debatable, but it is absolutely clear that it is not connected with the empirical subject, and with which comes along the ordinary conception of ethics. That is something which I wanted to add.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
So we,
Bell is also ringing now, Sandeep.
yeah. So now it is time to. Professor Bhattacharya would like to say something.
I think that I will meet up with the speaker and better. But just, I mean, pardon my immaturity, and I was just thinking that if I have to put Wittgenstein's solistic self with Descartes, I think therefore I am. I mean, would they get into a fist fight? But I think that this I will have my discussion in my way with Vikram. But thank you. It was I was being my training into some kind of mathematics. I was more into the Tractatus. I mean, trying to understand the symbol part. But this perspectives I really enjoyed, and thank you, Professor Panda, for giving people like us this kind of a platform to learn more about the mystic realm of philosophy. As Professor Pradhan said, enigmatic. I really like that adjective. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Bhattacharya. I think the time is now to close the session. I thank the speaker, Professor Sirola, for um, giving this most valuable and valuable closure to this series, I would say, because this is no doubt the central theme of um, um, Tractatus, and also the central to life as a whole. So one has to, and Wittgenstein, I think, um, tried to see life from that perspective of eternity, and therefore this talk is was very important for all of us, and I thank you uh, on behalf of the forum for this lecture, and I also thank Professor Pradhan for sharing the session and giving his own reflection, not only on this lecture but in the entire series. It was a learning experience for all of us, because when we read Tractatus, it was no sometime back in the classroom of 92, 93. So but revisiting Tractatus in its centenary year was another experience, I would say. Many eminent speakers um, shared their views in this particular forum. Professor Pradhan himself started his lecture in on 21st August 2021, followed by Eli Fredlander, then um, Pasquale, and many. Priyambada Sarkar was one of the speakers. So many eminent speakers have uh, uh, said or shared their views, and we are all grateful to all the speakers who have associated themselves with us, with the forum's activities. And we are also, I mean, this lecture series will be published by Routledge. Routledge has, we have signed an agreement with Routledge, so it should be published. All those who have contributed to this lecture. Um, the other important point is that though we are celebrating the centenary lecture series of Tractatus, Tractatus is going to be read, I mean, the way we have been rereading, reinterpreting, and trying to see whether ethics, I mean, if ethics is was the central and deep behind, um, uh, the lines of the Tractatus aphorisms, then it is going to be um, a book which will live for another centuries or many more centuries to come. It is not a book for this century. It is the book for the entire history of human civilization. That's in that sense, because humanity cannot give away logic. Humanity cannot give away language. Humanity will not give away ethics. So these are the three pillars of epistemology or philosophy. I think that would be definitely um, um, needed by all the intellectuals, um, not only those who are doing philosophy right now, today, also tomorrow, and the intellectuals who will come in future. So Tractatus is going to be a seminal book, and many more centenary lectures will be held. I'm sure no, the future generation will celebrate in much more in details, with some new findings, that why he was concerned with ethics and all that, or why he was concerned with life, salvation, mysticism, um, logic, language. So, so the curiosity will remain, I think philosophers live in that um, realm of consciousness always. They were wanderers. So, as long as they are wanderers, they will find new meanings in Tractatus. So, I thank all the audience who have joined in this lecture series and have made it one of the successful lecture series. Thank you once again to all the participants who came today. And now, for future, we will definitely announce our another series lecture in advance, and we will let you know on what way we will be celebrating our academic activities here in this forum.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Thank you, everybody. And
Thank
I
you.
wish on my behalf a happy Diwali to all of you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you,
Diwali
everyone.
to everybody.
Thank